The library at Aversley Hall had 40 years of quiet in its walls, and it was in that quiet that Mr. Pemberton, the solicitor from Taunton, read the will aloud on a grey October morning, while the rain pressed softly at the windows, and no one in the room made a sound. Cecily Brant stood at the edge of the gathered figures, close to the door, wearing a gown that had been altered once already at the sleeve. She had positioned herself there deliberately, so that she might slip out when it was finished, without having to pass through the center of the room, where Lady Aversley sat enthroned in black silk among her two distant cousins and her nephew, Mr. San. Hartley, whose collar was too stiff and whose expression suggested he expected to be pleased. She had known she would not be mentioned. The late Lord Aversley had told her nothing, left her no indication, and she was not the sort of woman who permitted herself to hope for what she had not been promised. She had hoped none the less, privately, in the small hours of the morning since his death, because he had been kind to her, and she had believed in the manner of a young woman who had spent 8 years in a house without belonging to it. That kindness must eventually mean something. It did not mean anything. Mr. Mentor. Pemberton read for 12 minutes, and in those 12 minutes the estate, the house, the farms, and the income from the Dorset property passed to the late Lord's son, Edmund Farley, Earl of Aversley, who had not yet arrived. The dower arrangement for Lady Aversley was confirmed. Generous and precise, a small bequest went to Mrs. Paget, the housekeeper. A sum went to the head groom. There was nothing for Cecily, not a cottage, not a year's wages, not a line. Lady Aversley did not look at her. This was itself a kind of statement. Cecily kept her face still and her hands quiet at her sides because she had learned long ago that the best defense she possessed in this house was composure, and she would not surrender it now in front of Mr. Pasa. Hartley, whose small eyes had moved toward her the moment Mr. Pemberton reached the end of the document and paused. He had looked at her the way a person looks at something they have just confirmed is worth nothing. She was nearly to the door when it opened. The man who entered was tall, with dark hair cut close, and a face that the years away had made severe in a way that was different from coldness, and it was the severity of someone who had learned to trust very little. He wore a plain traveling coat, still damp at the shoulder. He had not changed. He had come straight in. His eyes moved across the room in a single unhurried pass, and when they reached Cecily, they stopped. Not long. Only a moment. It was not the look of a man who did not see her. It was the look of a man cataloguing. Something he had not expected to find. She stepped aside to let him through. He said nothing to her. She went out, pulled the door behind her, and stood in the corridor with her hands pressed flat against her thighs, and told herself she had not hoped. She had been 8 years old when her father, Captain Brant, brought her to Aversley Hall for the first time, riding up from Taunton in the autumn mud to call on his old friend the Earl. She had been 14 when he died, and the Earl had ridden to her school in Bath to say she was to come to Aversley, that she would be looked after, that she was to consider it her home. She had not called it her home in the years since because it was not precise. She was a ward, and a ward is a category, not a daughter, and she had been careful not to confuse them. She had been careful about a great many things. She managed the correspondence, she read to Lady Aversley. In the evenings, she accompanied the younger cousins to morning calls. She knew where every document in the household was filed, because the late lord had trusted her with that work in the last 2 years of his life, when his eyesight troubled him and his hands had stiffened. She had done this work gratefully and without expectation. And now the work was finished, and she was 22 years old and had £34 in a savings box in her room, and no position she could name. It was Mrs. Anashan Paget, who found her in the linen room that afternoon, counting sheets with a concentration that had nothing to do with sheets. The housekeeper was a compact, gray-haired woman who had been at Aversley since before the old Earl married his second wife, and who had formed opinions about that marriage that she kept entirely to herself, except in the very occasional and very private instance when someone she trusted was in need of the truth. She set her hand briefly on Cecily's arm. "He noticed you," she said at the door. "He noticed everyone," Cecily said. "It is the sort of face that notices. Mrs. Sid." Paget looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has been a housekeeper for a long time and has learned to say many things without saying them. Then she went away down the corridor with the quiet step she always used, and Cecily counted the rest of the sheets. 3 days after the reading of the will, Lady Aversley received Miss Wrentham in the drawing-room. Miss Wrentham was the niece of Sir Gerald Wrentham, and the acknowledged beauty of the county season, and she came dressed in pale rose, with a very small hat that she wore as though it had been designed for her in Paris and had been. Lady Aversley was wearing mourning, but she wore it, as she wore everything, with the precision of a woman who understood that mourning was also a kind of display. They sat together near the window, and Cecily was sent in with the tea and then told she might go. She was at the door when she heard Lady Aversley say, her voice warm and lowered by precisely the degree required to be accidentally overheard by no one except the person she intended to reach. Of course, Cecily is devoted to the house. One must make certain allowances for the charity girl. She has nowhere else to go. Cecily went out. She shut the door without a sound and stood in the corridor a moment, and then walked on. She did not see Edmund again until he summoned her to the library. The message came through a footman. At 9:30 in the morning, 4 days after the will reading, Lord Aversley wished to speak with Miss Brant at her convenience. Cecily understood that at her convenience meant now, and she went. The library was the room she had spent the most time in during the last years of the late lord's life, and it was strange to stand in it now with the wrong man at the desk. Edmund Farley had the estate accounts open in front of him, and a letter from the tenant farm agent folded to one side, and he was making notes in a hand that was precise and spare, with none of the late lord's elaborate loops. He did not look up when she entered, which she had expected. She stood at a careful distance from the desk and waited. "You managed the correspondence," he said. "It was not a question." "For the last 2 years, my lord." His eyesight troubled him. "In the last seasons?" "Yes," he put down the pen. He looked at her then directly, and she remembered the look from the doorway, the same quality of attention, the same sense that he was calculating something she was not permitted to see. "I need to understand the estate's current obligations. There are 3 tenant leases whose renewal terms are not in these accounts." "Where would they be filed?" she told him. He wrote it down. He asked her about the West Wing repairs, about the arrangement with the mill at Denton, about the standing agreement with the apothecary for the cottagers' families. She answered each question precisely, because precision was what he appeared to want, and because she was not going to perform ignorance before a man who had the intelligence not to be fooled by it. "Sit down," he said, midway through. She sat. He asked her 3 more questions, then leaned back slightly in the chair, not with ease because ease did not appear to be in his register, but with the quality of a man reassessing a preliminary judgment. "You know this house," he said. "I have been here 8 years. A pause. "And yet the will made no provision for you." The sentence landed with the particular weight of something said without heat, which was worse than anger would have been. Cecily kept her hands quiet in her lap. "I was not consulted about the will's provisions," she said. "I had no reason to expect any." He looked at her a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he picked up the pen again. "I will want the correspondence files for the past 3 years by Friday," he said. "All of them." She said she would have them ready. She rose, and she was nearly to the door when he said, without looking up, "Miss Brant." She turned. "You will not be put out of this house without notice." He said it as though it were an administrative matter. "I give my word on that." She thanked him. She went out, and in the corridor she stood for a moment with one hand at her sternum, pressing against the strange, unwilling warmth that had risen there, and told herself it was relief, and nothing more. If you have stayed with this story so far, I hope you will stay a little longer. What comes next is the part that changes everything. And it begins not with a letter or a declaration, but with a basket of medicines and a broken window latch. It was Mrs. Paget who told Cecily about old Mrs. Fenwick, the cottager at the Denton, Lane Holding, who had been ill for 10 days and had no daughter near enough to help. Cecily had been taking provisions to the estate's sick tenants since she was 17, Not because anyone asked her to, but because the late lord had done it before his health declined, and she had simply continued what he began. She put together a basket from the kitchen stores, filling it with barley and a pot of honey and a cloth packet of dried lavender from the stillroom, and stopped at the apothecary in the village for a tincture before she walked the half-mile to the cottage. She did not know Edmund had seen her leave the hall. She did not know he had followed at a distance, not out of suspicion, but out of something he could not have named. Precisely, she sat with Mrs. Fenwick for the better part of an hour. She read 2 psalms aloud from the old woman's Bible, the worn pages soft as cloth under her fingers. She heated the posset on the cottage fire and made certain Mrs. Fenwick drank it. Before she left, she noticed the window latch in the back room was broken at the hinge, and the draught that came through it was real and cold. And she went back to the kitchen, found a nail and a hammer in the drawer beneath the hearth, and fixed it herself, standing on a chair to reach the height of it, working quietly so as not to disturb the old woman resting behind the curtain. She came out of the cottage into the gray afternoon light to find the lane empty. She had no reason to believe anyone had been there. She walked home through the field path, the basket lighter, and her step not quite as careful as it usually was. The grass was silver with frost at the edges where the sun had not reached, and the elms along the path were bare and dark against the low sky, and the sound of her footsteps was the only sound in the cold afternoon. She did not see Edmund standing at the gate in the east garden, watching her come across the grass with the wind pulling at her cloak, and his face wearing an expression she would not have recognized if she had seen it, because she had not yet taught herself to look for anything of that kind in him. He had not intended to follow her. He had gone as far as the lane to check the condition of the east gate posts, which wanted replacing, and had then simply remained. He could not have given a satisfactory account of why, except that the lane was cold and quiet, and she was moving through it with complete unconcern for being observed, in the way of someone who does not expect the world to notice her. And there was something in that unconcern that he found he could not leave. He was in the library when she passed it. The door was open. He was reading. He did not speak to her. She went upstairs. It was 4 days after the cottage visit that Mrs. Paget appeared at the door of the correspondence room where Cecily was sorting the estate files for Edmund, and said in a voice barely above a murmur, "Come with me." The west wing at Aversley Hall had been closed since the late lord's illness worsened. The corridor smelled of old paper and cold stone, and the light through the covered windows was the color of cream. Mrs. Paget led Cecily to the room that had been the late lord's private study before he moved everything downstairs to the library, and opened the inner cupboard beside the chimney-piece, and from the back of the highest shelf brought down a small locked box of dark wood, hardly larger than a writing case. She set it on the table and opened it with a key she wore on a chain at her apron. "He gave me the key 2 years before he died," Mrs. Paget said. "He said if anything happened to him I was to keep this until the right moment. I have been waiting to know when that was." Inside the box were 3 things. The first was a letter written in the late lord's hand to Mr. Sard, Coldeck of the firm, Coldeck and Renshaw in Taunton, dated the autumn of the year before he had formally engaged Mr. Pemberton for his household affairs. The letter described, in the late lord's deliberate and rather formal phrasing, his intention to establish a trust settlement for Miss Cecily Brant Ward, comprising the use of the Denton Lane cottage property for her lifetime and a capital sum of £800. He had written that he wished her to be independent. He had written that she had been a daughter to him in all the ways that mattered to a man who understood what mattered. Cecily read the letter twice before she could read it clearly, because her eyes were doing something she could not entirely prevent. The second item was a copy of a document she did not at first recognize, and then did. It was a letter in the late lord's hand addressed to his son. It began with the words, "My dear Edmund," and it was dated 3 years ago, which meant it had been written while Edmund was with his regiment in Portugal. It described the stepmother. It described the household. It described Cecily. It described what the late lord believed about the estate, and about the settlement he had drawn up, and about what he hoped for his son's return. It was a careful, affectionate letter, full of the things a father says to a son he has been forbidden to say in person, It had never been sent. The third item was a second letter, also from the late Lord to Edmund, written the following year. Also never sent. Also intercepted. Cecily sat with her hands in her lap, and the letters before her on the table, and the late afternoon gray at the covered windows, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes from seeing a pattern all at once after years of seeing only its separate parts, what had been done. The letters to Edmund, held back for years, so that he returned home believing his father had ceased to love him. The settlement for Cecily, apparently never formalized with Mr. Colbeck, leaving her without documentation. And then the will Mr. Pemberton had read aloud, which had been prepared by Mr. Pemberton and not by Colbeck and Renshaw, and which contained nothing of what this letter described. Lady Aversley had not simply secured her own position. She had reordered the entire world of this house to protect it. "What will you do?" Mrs. Paget asked. Cecily folded the late Lord's letter to Colbeck with care and placed it back in the box. "I need to think," she said. She sat with Mrs. Croft Paget for another quarter-hour without speaking, in the way of two women who have lived in the same house long enough to have learned the other's silences. The fire in the west wing grate was unlit, and the room was cold, and outside the window the afternoon had gone entirely to gray when she finally rose to go. She took the box with her, wrapped in her shawl against the corridor's chill. Perhaps you have been in a position once, however different, of holding something true in your hands and knowing that the moment you act on it, nothing will be the same. If you have, you know what that particular stillness feels like. Cecily sat with it the whole of that evening. The crisis came from an unexpected direction, as crises generally do. In the days between finding the box and writing to Mr. Colbeck, Cecily went about her ordinary tasks with a care she had not had to exercise since the early months of her first year at Aversley, when she had not yet learned the particular discipline of appearing untroubled. She sat with Lady Aversley at breakfast. She arranged the correspondence she was supposed to be filing for Edmund. She went to the library when he summoned her, twice, and answered his questions about the estate with the precision that had become their shared working language. And she did not say anything about the box or the letters because she was not yet certain what saying something would accomplish. The letter to Mr. E.T.O. Colbeck was written on a Thursday night, in the small, clear hand her father's tutor had taught her at 8 years old, and she sealed it by the light of a single candle and set it in her coat pocket, and said nothing about it to anyone. She posted it at 6 the following morning, before the house was awake. It was Mr. Hartley, who brought on the crisis. Lady Aversley's nephew had been at Aversley Hall for a week now, having arrived uninvited 4 days after the will reading, with 2 trunks and the comfortable expectation of being welcomed. He was a broad, florid man with an appetite for port and for making assessments of property, and he had a particular quality of attention for Cecily that she found easier to manage by not being in the same room with him. On the evening of the day she found the box, she was carrying a lamp along the lower corridor toward the back stair when she heard voices from the dining room, where Mr. Hartley had remained, after dinner with Edmund and a decanter. She would not have paused. She was not in the habit of listening at doors. She heard her name, and she stopped. Mr. Hartley's voice was carrying, well, as it always did when he had been comfortable with the decanter. "Your father's charity girl is stirring up trouble, Aversley. I have it from one of the maids. She has been in the west wing." A silence. Then Edmund's voice came, level and unhurried. "Miss Brant has the run of this house. My father gave her that. Your father gave her a great deal he should not have." A sound of glass on wood. "Lady Aversley has had her patience tried beyond what most women would bear. The girl has no standing here, no position, no useful function. Now the old man is gone, and if I were you I should say so plainly and have it finished." Edmund said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, and she could not make out the words. She went on to the back stair and up to her room, and sat at the table and wrote 3 letters. One went to Mr. Frasher, Colbeck at the firm of Colbeck and Renshaw in Taunton, a second to the late Lord's old friend Lord Felbridge in Bath, and a third she sealed and set aside for Edmund, which contained the bare facts of what she had found, with the letter from the locked box enclosed in copy. She did not give the letter to Edmund. She put it in her writing case. The following morning, Lady Aversley came to her room. She came early, before Cecily had finished dressing, and she did not knock. She stood in the doorway in her black silk with her fan already open, and her face wore the composed expression of a woman accustomed to managing situations. She said that it had come to her attention that Cecily had been in the West Wing. She said that the West Wing was closed. She said that she understood Cecily's position was an uncomfortable one, and that she had great sympathy for young women of limited means, but that the practicalities of the situation had to be faced. The will had been read, the estate had an earl, and there was simply no further role for Cecily at Aversley Hall. "You have until the end of the month," she said, still composed, still pleasant. "I will write you a character, naturally, for any position you may seek." Cecily looked at her. She thought about the letter to Edmund sealed in her writing case, and about Mr. Colbeck, who had by now received her letter, and about Mrs. B. Paget, who had kept the box for 2 years, waiting for the right moment. She thought about the late Lord's deliberate phrasing, his written words coming back to her now. "She has been a daughter to me in all the ways that mattered." "Thank you, Lady Aversley," she said. "I will give your proposal my consideration." She had already sent her letter to Mr. Colbeck, by the early post, before Lady Aversley was awake. What she did not know until Mrs. R. Paget told her that afternoon, reporting it in the measured tone of someone who has taken care to have her information correct, was what Miss Wrentham had said at the Hargrove Assembly 3 evenings past while the county families drank their ratafia and arranged themselves by precedence. Miss Wrentham had been speaking with 2 ladies from the charred neighborhood, and she had said, with the particular lightness of someone who does not need to use force because her position does the work for her, "Oh, the charity girl." She was tolerated while the old Earl was alive. I imagine the new Earl will soon see that his father's charity had its limits. The county had heard it. The county had agreed largely, in the way that counties do, which is to say that most of them had not disagreed out loud. Cecily received this information with the quietness she had learned to maintain in front of others. She went to her room and took out Edmund's letter from her writing case, and sat with it for a long time. Then she went down to the library where she had heard him earlier, and knocked. He was at the estate accounts again. He looked up. She set the letter and the enclosed copy on the desk in front of him without speaking. He read it. He did not hurry. His face did not change in any large way, but she watched his jaw set, slowly, and watched his hand flatten against the desk in the manner of a man controlling the impulse to do something his discipline would not permit. He read the copy of his father's letter to Colbeck. Twice, he set it down. He looked at her. "You wrote to Colbeck," he said. "It was not an accusation." "Yes, before you gave me this." "Yes." Another silence, not an angry one. Why? She thought about how to answer that precisely. "Because I did not know," she said at last, "whether you would believe me, and because if the provenance of the will is to be examined properly, it should be examined by someone with the legal authority to do so. And that is Mr. Colbeck's firm, and not mine." Edmund looked at the letter from his father. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Something crossed his face that she did not try to name because it was not hers to name. When he finally set the paper down, his voice was entirely level. "My father wrote to me," he said. Not a question, not an exclamation. A statement, carefully placed. Like a man setting a heavy thing down where it can rest. "He wrote to you," she said several times. He did not say anything else. She left him there with the letters. The autumn gathering at Aversley Hall had been a fixture of the county calendar since the late Lord's father's time, and Lady Aversley had given no instruction to cancel it, which Cecily had understood as a sign that she had not yet perceived how close the ground was beneath her. The event was held on a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of October, with a cold moon over the stone front of the hall, and the carriages of the Wrenthams and the Hargroves and the Denton families, arranged along the drive, and the great downstairs rooms open and candlelit in the manner of a house still confident in its own authority. Mr. Colbeck had arrived that afternoon from Taunton. He had come with a younger partner, a Mr. Daunt, who carried a leather case. He had also sent word ahead to the magistrate, Mr. Tad Farwell of Shard, who arrived separately and stood now near the study with the particular air of a man who does not enjoy the evening's errand, but understands its necessity. Cecily was present at the gathering in her capacity as household support, wearing her plain dark gown, carrying nothing, standing near the far wall of the drawing-room while Lady Aversley moved through the assembled company with Miss Wrentham at her side, arranging the evening with the ease of a woman who believes the arrangements have already been made in her favor. Mr. Hartley stood near the fire, talking with Sir Gerald Wrentham about shooting. Edmund entered the drawing-room at 8:15. He wore a dark coat, well cut, with a white cravat, tied with a spare exactness that characterized everything about him. He paused at the threshold for only a moment, taking in the assembled company with the same unhurried assessment he brought to estate accounts and to letter files and to the faces of strangers he was deciding whether to trust. The candlelight of the great drawing-room caught the planes of his face without softening them. He was not performing ease. He had simply arrived. He crossed the room with the deliberate pace of a man who has decided what he is going to do, and sees no reason to rush it. The room responded to him the way rooms respond to men who carry a specific kind of weight, and conversations quieted. Faces turned, attention shifted, without anyone intending it. He acknowledged Sir Gerald. He accepted a glass he did not drink from, and he moved through the company until he reached the center of the room, where Lady Aversley stood with Miss Wrentham on one side and Mr. Sturia, Hartley on the other, and the fire behind her casting everyone in gold. She looked up at him. Her fan moved once, lightly. "Edmund, how pleasant!" "Lady Aversley." He looked at her without inflection. Then he looked at Mr. Prest. Colbeck, who had entered from the study door. Mr. Daunt was behind him. Mr. Farwell came last. Lady Aversley's fan stilled. Mr. said, "Colbeck tells me," Edmund said, and his voice was quiet enough that the room had to go quieter still to hear it, and so it did, "that he holds a secondary copy of my father's instructions to his firm dated 6 years ago, which was never superseded in the records of Colbeck and Renshaw. He further tells me that the handwriting in the will Mr. Pemberton read last month does not match the handwriting in the late Lord's existing signed correspondence in 3 distinguishing particulars." "Lady Aversley," said Edmund, "this is not the occasion." "Miss Brant is my ward," Edmund said, "and this will is a fraud." The room did not make a sound. Not a glass moved. The fire crackled once, and then the silence closed over it. Lady Aversley's hand came up, and it was shaking, which was the first time Cecily had ever seen it shake, and something in her registered this, not with triumph, but with something closer to grief, because the woman had been here since before Cecily arrived, and had been woven into the house for 10 years, and her hands were shaking, and she looked suddenly smaller than she had ever looked. "You do not understand what the estate required," Lady Aversley said. Her voice was controlled but thin. "You were not here. You chose not to be here. Someone had to manage it." "Someone forged a document," Edmund said, still quiet, still level. "Mr. Farwell has reviewed Mr. Colbeck's findings and will be making the appropriate inquiries. You will want to speak with a solicitor of your own. I would recommend you do so this week." Mr. Hartley had not spoken. His face had gone the color of old plaster. Miss Wrentham had moved 3 steps to the left, away from Lady Aversley, with the delicate instinct of a woman who has always positioned herself beside confidence and has noticed, quickly, that the confidence has shifted. Lady Aversley looked for one unguarded moment directly at Cecily. It was not anger. It was something more complicated, something Cecily thought might have been, in another kind of woman or another kind of life, recognition. Then she turned and walked from the room with the composed step she had always used, and the company parted for her, and she was gone. The room exhaled. People began, cautiously, to speak again. Sir Gerald put down his glass, exchanged a look with the county magistrate. Mr. Colbeck crossed to speak with Edmund, low and practical. Mr. Daunt opened his case. Cecily did not move from the wall. She watched Edmund, as he spoke, with Mr. Baugh. Colbeck, as he received the procedural confirmation that the settlement the late lord had described in his letter to the firm could be established now under the valid instrument, as he absorbed the information with the same controlled stillness he brought to everything. Once across the room, he glanced at her. It was the same look he had given her in the doorway. On the first day. The cataloging look. The look that saw. This time she did not persuade herself. It was something ordinary. The month of November came early to Somerset that year. There was frost on the grass by the 20th, and the first snow followed it by 3 days, light and dry, dusting the stone sills of the hall and collecting in the bare branches of the oak at the garden edge. The county had spoken by then in the way counties speak. There had been a series of carefully worded morning calls, a consensus assembled without votes, a verdict arrived at by the accumulated weight of individual assessments. The consensus was that Lady Aversley had been foolish. The consensus was that Mr. Hartley had been complicit. The consensus was that Miss Brant had conducted herself with dignity throughout. Nobody said the last part to her face, but Mrs. Paget said it, which was better. Lady Aversley had gone to her sister in Bath. Mr. Hartley had departed with his trunks. Mr. Colbeck's firm was in correspondence with the Aversley estate solicitors, and the matter was proceeding with the deliberate, unhurried certainty of legal processes when they are moving in the correct direction. The Denton Lane cottage had been opened and aired. £800 had been confirmed as owing. Cecily had not yet moved to the cottage. Edmund had not suggested she should hurry. Why? He found her one evening in the late lord's private study in the west wing, which had been opened now and aired and put back to use. She was cataloguing the remaining correspondence files, working by lamplight, methodical and quiet. In the way she was always methodical and quiet, her dark head bent over the papers with the total absorption of someone who finds comfort in work, because work has always been the thing she was permitted. He set something on the table beside her. It was the locked box. She looked at it, then at him. It was his, Edmund said. He would want you to have it. The letters are yours. She looked down at the box. The dark wood was warm from his hand. She did not speak for a moment because there was a particular quality to the silence between them that she had been learning these past weeks, which was that it did not require filling. He called you a daughter, she said at last. In the letter. He did. Edmund's voice was quiet. He was right. She put her hand on the box. Then very carefully, she said it plainly. And you. He wrote to you. He tried to. He stood still for a moment that stretched past the ordinary length of moments. Yes, he said, he did. Add. She heard in those 2 words the weight of 7 years. 7 years of believing himself forgotten, of carrying that silence like a stone, of returning to a house that felt foreign because the grief of it had never been able to name itself correctly. She did not try to fill that in with comfort, because he was not a man who would want comfort shaped into words. She simply stayed where she was, and the lamp between them cast its light across the table, and the letters, and the box, and the snow came down outside the west wing window in slow, unbothered silence. Cecily, he said. She had not heard him say her given name before. It was the first time, and it landed with the particular weight of something irrevocable, and she looked up at him. He crossed the small distance between the door and the table. He did not rush it. He came and stood where she could see his face clearly in the lamplight, and it wore the expression she had seen twice before, and not dared to read, and she read it now. He lifted her hand from the box, very gently, and held it with the particular care of a man who does not do things carelessly, and knows exactly what he is doing. You went to Colbeck, he said, before you came to me. I was not certain you would believe me, she said for the second time. I believe you, he said. I believed you before. Colbeck confirmed a word of it. The lamp guttered once in the draught from the corridor, and she felt the warmth of his hand around hers, and the cold of the old room, and the snow beyond the window, and the box on the table with the late lord's letters inside it, and she thought that this was what it felt like to have been seen. Not rescued, not chosen out of circumstance or convenience, but seen by someone who had looked deliberately and found something true. "Stay," he said. Not as a command this time, or not only. She said, "Yes." By Christmas, the West Wing study had become the room they used most often in the evenings, the fire banked high, and the lamp set on the table between their chairs, and the box placed on the mantel with its lid open, the letters inside still present. The cottage at Denton Lane had been opened and properly furnished, but Cecily had not been asked to move into it, and the question of whether she would had settled into the kind of agreement that does not require speaking aloud. Edmund read in the hours after supper without speaking, and Cecily wrote her correspondence without speaking, and the quiet between them was the kind that has been agreed on and is comfortable. Mrs. Paget brought tea at 9, and left without being asked to stay. Once on an evening when the snow came harder than usual, and pressed against the study window in a sustained low whisper, Edmund set down his book, and looked at her across the table for a moment without saying anything, and she looked back at him with the same quiet attention, and that was enough. One evening, some weeks after Christmas, Cecily set down her pen, and looked at the box on the mantel, and then at the man in the chair across from her, and she thought of the late lord's letter and his careful, deliberate phrasing, the words she had read a dozen times now. "She has been a daughter to me in all the ways that mattered." To a man who understood what mattered. She thought that he had not been wrong about what mattered. He had merely been wrong to leave it to chance. The snow was still coming at the window. Edmund turned a page. "The fire said the things fires say when they are left to themselves." She picked up her pen and went on with her letter. And outside the frost settled into the stones of the hall, and the bare oaks held their dark branches against a sky going quietly to stars. And nothing in the house was as it had been, and all of it was well. If this story moved you, leave a word in the comments. It means more than you might think. Thank you for staying until the end.